Dubai was designed to feel temporary, a city where people arrive, earn fast, and leave richer. No income tax, fast visas, luxury towers rising from the desert, and an expat population that once made up nearly 85 to 90% of residents. Mobility was part of the promise. But something unusual has started to change. More professionals who once planned a 3 to 5 year stay are now restructuring their finances, buying property earlier than expected, or shifting capital just to secure a 10-year golden visa. What used to be a flexible stop is quietly turning into a longer commitment, not always by choice, but by design. A consultant in Dubai Marina recently turned down a higher-paying role in Singapore because switching jurisdictions could mean losing residency stability tied to property ownership. The visa meant to provide freedom is beginning to influence career decisions. And that raises a deeper question. When residency becomes tied to assets and assets tie you to the system, does mobility still exist, or has the exit quietly become more expensive than staying? Dubai's rise was built on a simple psychological contract. Come, earn, leave. For decades, the city functioned less like a permanent society and more like a high-speed economic platform where mobility was the core feature. Expats could scale income quickly, companies could scale headcount quickly, and capital could flow in and out with minimal friction, a system optimized for velocity, not permanence. The Golden Visa subtly changed that equation. On paper, a 10-year residency sounds like flexibility, but in practice it often requires anchoring capital into specific assets, most commonly real estate worth 2 million dirhams or more. The shift seems small, but it changes incentives. Mobility begins to depend on maintaining exposure to the local asset cycle. A finance manager relocating from London to Business Bay described the decision as insurance disguised as opportunity. Buying property was no longer purely an investment choice, it became a residency strategy. Once the visa is tied to an asset, the asset quietly becomes tied to future decisions. This creates the first structural tension. A system originally designed for fluid movement is gradually rewarding longer-term commitment. Flexibility starts to narrow, not because movement is restricted, but because leaving begins to carry higher opportunity cost. And that pressure is showing up in behavior patterns. Property transactions above the Golden Visa threshold have clustered in specific districts, Dubai Marina, downtown, Palm Jumeirah, suggesting that residency considerations are influencing where capital flows. Apartments that once functioned as temporary housing are increasingly treated as strategic footholds inside the system. This is where the contradiction begins to form. The Golden Visa was introduced to make Dubai more attractive to global talent, but the mechanism that grants stability also increases dependency on local asset values. Residency becomes partially exposed to market cycles, interest rates, property demand, liquidity conditions, forces that residents do not fully control. Mobility, once the defining advantage of the expat model, starts to carry switching costs. And once switching costs appear, behavior changes. Recruiters in Singapore and Hong Kong have begun noticing candidates hesitating longer before accepting relocation offers, especially when relocation would disrupt eligibility windows tied to visa requirements. A decision that once depended primarily on salary now includes an additional calculation: how much optionality is lost by leaving. At the surface level, the Golden Visa expands freedom. At the structural level, it changes how freedom is exercised, because when residency becomes linked to capital commitment, every market fluctuation subtly influences personal mobility, and that creates a feedback loop between policy design and individual risk tolerance. But real estate is only one layer of the system. The deeper pressure comes from how Dubai's growth model interacts with long-term population stability and why a city built on transience is now quietly encouraging permanence. Dubai's long-term growth has always depended on a delicate balance: attract global talent without requiring permanent integration. The city scaled quickly because people didn't need to fully relocate their identity, only their productivity. But once a critical mass of residents begins staying longer, the system starts facing pressures it was never originally designed to absorb. Longer stays increase demand for stability, schooling, Healthcare continuity, career progression, family planning, layers that require deeper infrastructure commitment. A tech founder who initially moved to Dubai for tax efficiency now faces a different calculation. Relocating again would disrupt children already enrolled in British curriculum schools, charging 60,000 to 120,000 dirhams per year. The longer the stay, the higher the switching friction. This creates the second contradiction. A city optimized for flexibility is gradually accumulating residents who require predictability. And predictability introduces expectations, legal clarity, cost stability, long-term housing affordability, variables that are harder to maintain in a system built on continuous inflow of capital. Around the midpoint of this shift sits the real mechanism. Dubai's model relies heavily on sustained capital attraction to maintain growth momentum. Golden visas function as a stabilizer for this model, encouraging high-income residents to internalize part of the long-term demand cycle through property ownership, business formation, or financial presence. What looks like residency policy is also capital retention architecture, because when enough residents anchor assets locally, capital becomes less volatile. Real estate demand becomes more resilient. Consumption patterns stabilize. Financial services deepen. Each long-term resident increases the predictability of economic flows, reducing sensitivity to external shocks. But stability introduces dependency. When residency incentives align closely with asset ownership, the system becomes more sensitive to asset cycles. A cooling property market doesn't just affect investors, it affects perceived residency security. Even if visas remain legally valid, the psychological link between investment and belonging begins to influence risk perception. And perception changes behavior faster than policy changes rules. Recruitment firms increasingly report senior professionals negotiating hybrid arrangements, maintaining eligibility conditions in Dubai while testing opportunities elsewhere. Instead of full relocation, some are creating parallel options, partial presence, asset retention, flexible commitments. The system begins to produce a new type of resident, neither fully transient nor fully permanent. Semi-attached capital, semi-attached talent, semi-attached risk. This hybrid state can strengthen resilience, but it also narrows optionality. The more individuals structure decisions around maintaining eligibility, the more personal strategy becomes intertwined with policy design, which leads to the symbolic contradiction at the center of the golden visa era. A policy created to increase mobility is slowly shaping decisions that reduce it. Not through restriction, but through alignment of incentives. Dubai still offers extraordinary flexibility compared to most global cities, but flexibility is no longer costless. It increasingly requires maintaining exposure to the same system that provides the advantage. And that raises the bigger model question. Can a city built on transients evolve into a semi-permanent hub without changing the incentives that made it grow so fast? Or does long-term stability require a different balance between openness and attachment? One that subtly shifts the psychological contract between the city and the people who power it. Because the golden visa is not just changing how long people stay, it is changing how people decide whether they can leave.